Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Nicole Quinn. Welcome to the Lab Coats and Life podcast, where we help scientists thrive. I'm here today with Dr. Jason Goldsmith, co-host of the Immunology podcast. The Lab Coats and Life podcast is brought to you by STEMCELL Technologies, a global biotechnology company supporting life sciences research and fostering communication and collaboration in science. If you enjoy the Lab Coats and Life podcast, rate us and leave a review. You can also suggest ideas or recommend guests for new episodes. Today on Lab Coats and Life, we have Lynn Csontos, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at STEMCELL Technologies. Lynn has been working within the regulatory affairs world for more than a decade and is here to discuss and help all of us understand the ever-changing cell therapy regulatory landscape. But before we get to that, the STEMCELL Technologies Mentorship Resources area features various free downloadable toolkits, including a collection of templates and spreadsheets to help you organize your lab space. To download these resources, visit www.stemcell.com/labtemplates or find more practical resources at www.stemcell.com/labcoatsandlife. Lynn, welcome to Lab Coats and Life. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to see you. Let's jump right in and just start with like a big picture idea of what your role entails. And maybe you can start with an explanation of what is regulatory affairs for our listeners who are not really sure what it means. What do you do? And then what are your accountabilities? What does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, so it varies between different types of companies. So I would say that the accountabilities that I have at STEMCELL Technologies, who supplies reagents for the manufacture of cell and gene therapies, will be a bit different than the leader of a regulatory team that is actually manufacturing a drug substance such as a cell and gene therapy. So it does differ a little bit, but in general, I would say that regulatory affairs is responsible for reviewing the global landscape and the regulations and guidances and standards that are out there that are applicable to the type of product that you are intending to market, and then interpreting them into your quality systems and your business. So ultimately, I would say in a nutshell, that is what our job is that interpreter to the business. Of course, it also includes conversations with the regulators, conversations with customers, etc. But I would say at a high level, that's where I would start.
All right. And so I come at this from more the traditional pharma perspective, where you have BLAs going in, which we can talk about acronyms in a bit. But how does this work when you're providing the manufacturing reagents or what have you, or support to someone else's license? I've experienced from the other side and had to ask, but what is it like being asked and working through that as that supplier?
Absolutely. One wouldn't ever think that you would associate the word creativity with regulatory affairs. But in the absence of regulations, of which there are no global regulations currently for reagents used for the manufacture of cell and gene therapies, however, there are some guidances that are out there, and we're starting to see those come up in different jurisdictions, and even standards from the ISO standard perspective. But what we do here at STEMCELL and other suppliers of reagents is that we evaluate a proxy guidance and regulations and apply it internally. So it is a careful path, or let's say a careful evaluation that we have to apply, because the cost of making a perfect reagent to the level of an injectable drug, let's say, yes, that this would be highly desirable from the market, but that would be cost exorbitant. And that would not be an appropriate way to position a business. So that's a great question. It's a tricky role. And I think that creativity adjective is good, but also a flexibility and a learner's attitude, because when we get feedback from the regulators, which we do, because we do file our master files that detail information that is then leveraged in INDs or those acronyms we'll cover later, as you said, and other such submissions. So all of the information is captured there.
I was about to ask you if you guys were master files as your main tool that then other groups could leverage. But maybe as one of our acronyms to discuss with a larger audience or concepts, do you want to describe what a master file is that, say, like my company would then ask for permission to use?
Yes. So the master file, we do file master files in the jurisdictions that will accept them. So right now that is the US, Canada, and Japan, and there are other jurisdictions as well, but those are major ones. And I will comment later on Europe. However, we do file these master files, and what this is I would say a lighter touch CMC. So chemistry manufacturing controls that you would see traditionally in an IND or a BLA. So this is a comprehensive description of your manufacturing process, your formulation, all of your testing, all your viral clearance, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't want to openly share that with our customers and the industry because we don't have IP coverage on it. So it is important as a business to keep that private, but at the same time, we have to be able to show someone, which is the regulators, so that they can make that risk assessment and evaluate the use of our materials for those cell and gene therapy manufacturing.
Can we go back for some? I know, Jason, you can give a little intro to why you're so well versed in this, and I'm not particularly well versed in it. Let's go back and let's do the acronym stuff because we're using things like IND and I missed the other one. So what are, I've got some that I want to define, but let's start with IND because we've already used it. So what does that mean?
Yeah, that's investigational new drug. So that is a term that is used in the US with the FDA, but in other jurisdictions like as Europe and Canada, they use clinical trial applications, so a CTA. Once you go through your clinical trials, if you're a drug product, you would have an NDA, a new drug application, or if it is a biological product, it would be a BLA, so that's a biological licensing application. And in jurisdictions such as Europe, it would be an MAA, which is a marketing authorization application. So it is absolutely a alphabet soup in regulatory affairs, and then combine that with the alphabet soup that exists in science. It is definitely can be discombobulating to have conversations, and it is a different, set of vocabulary that needs to be introduced to an organization so that you can have effective conversations even internally.
That's an awesome segue into when we were prepping for this episode. I said to Jason, what do you want to ask Lynn? What are some of the questions? And he said, where did you learn all of this? How did you learn? Because he was specifically mentioning the language that you have to use when you're communicating with regulatory bodies, I guess. But then, you also need to know all of the science, and the science changes very quickly. So maybe let's go backwards and talk about your career trajectory and where you learn this, and then also how you keep on top of it all.
Yeah, so definitely it's not something that when I was in my school part of my life, was it available as a curriculum that you could go to an institute or university to learn. So that is, I'm seeing popping up in different jurisdictions as well. So that's exciting because I think it is a very desirable place to pursue for a career. And it is very exciting, but it is, as demonstrated through my career, is something that I learned along the way. So I started in this industry. So when I say that, it's life sciences or pharma, biotech. I started 28 years ago, and I started in R&D. And I had graduated from NAIT, which is a technical institute. So this is in northern Alberta, in Edmonton. And what I took was chemical technology. So my first foray into this sector was starting in R&D, and we were very focused on small molecule products. So it was all organic chemistry, and then I transferred from R&D over to process development. So that's where we focused on the micrograms ideas that we had in R&D into gram scale quantities in process development, and then into manufacturing. From there, I was lucky enough to be asked to join the quality assurance team. I loved being in the lab. I loved manufacturing material that I knew was going to be used in clinical trials for different indications. And this, at the beginning of my career, is specifically for metastatic breast cancer. So I was very excited about that, but it was a nice change to go learn more about quality assurance. And within about 3 months of that shift in my career from being in the lab to sitting at a desk and overseeing everything that the business did related to the manufacture and product characterization, I learned that I had fell in love with something that I didn't even know existed. So it really suited my personality. I loved learning about processes and systems and how to connect that all and really build in that compliance mindset. So I fell in love, and that's where I lived in quality assurance for over a decade, and then eventually transitioned into the regulatory affairs world. But I think that full journey has given me a wonderful schooling, let's say, a wonderful education, because it has given me the ability to sort of see or live within somebody's mindset or shoes from the ideation all the way to the commercialization of the product. So sometimes people in regulatory affairs have only been in regulatory affairs and have never worked in the lab. And sometimes the ideas that come from them don't make sense. So it really is good for those that even are in regulatory affairs that have never worked in the lab to really take the time to listen to the SMEs or the subject matter experts across the organization, so you can really come up with the right strategies moving forward. So all in all, learning this language and the way to talk about it has been a 28-year journey, and I am not at the end of that journey. There are still things that are constantly shifting. So I am in constant conversations. I'm as part of many, many, many newsletters. And I'm just keeping a learning mindset as it continues to shift and change.
So you described a pretty common flow I've seen, right? R&D, eventually into CMC, because that's where you start getting regulated, right? So CMC is chemical manufacturing controls. That's actually where I'm a physician scientist in CMC. So
okay.
Been in the weird space too. And then quality assurance. Mm-hmm. And then you start either in CMC or in QA, you start working with regulatory because you're writing the documents, and then eventually you get some expertise and you go work in regulatory. So I've seen that path. But what about people who, for instance, there's not a ton of R&D jobs all the way, but there's lots of these other industry jobs in science. How can they, and I really respect and agree with the point, to get some lab time or some, floor time, but how can they make a way towards regulatory, if this sounds cool, without having to find that coveted magical R&D spot as an associate scientist or a scientist out of school or grad school or anything else that are, everyone wants and are hard to get?
100%. And I would say for STEMCELL Technologies and the fact that I'm lucky enough to be the head of regulatory affairs, I welcome them to just contact me. I get contacts on LinkedIn all the time asking about how to get into the regulatory affairs space. And absolutely right. The one pathway that, Jason, you highlighted that is usual, the one that I followed isn't always the necessary pathway. So I think the key idea, the the key requirements is that you have to at least be interested. And let me tell you, reading regulations and guidances will kill some people of boredom. Okay, so you have to at least start with some spark of interest in this space. And then if you do have that interest, then by all means, or I would say the second thing is you have to have an open mind, a creative mind, an ability to have strong critical thinking and adaptability. So you're, as a regulatory specialist or regulatory professional, you have to listen. You're not God. You're not going to come in and just state in a very autocratic manner what has to happen. There are some situations where this happens because ultimately everything that we do has to keep patient safety in mind. So there are some things that are very, very black and white, very specific, but in many, many other areas, it is about adapting and creating the right fit for your business. And some people complain about how vague regulations are, and people are desperate for that black and white, very prescriptive requirements on facilities, equipment, training, all of those kind of things. But thank goodness it isn't, because it allows that adaptability and translation to the right fit for your business.
I just want to reflect on that a little. I'm in a boat where there's no guidance or regulation for our products. So I found that scientific curiosity combined with patient first is really that key, right? Of how do you communicate that with what you're doing and why it's well reasoned, and that's why I've enjoyed this space, right? It's that argument for getting it out to the patient, but being very clear about why it's safe.
It sounds like kind of a really perfect role for somebody who has thrived in science, because you get that, attention to detail and really rigorous mind when you, like you're saying, to be able to, really care about regulations and be able to read these very intense documents. But also that space for nuance and creativity and big picture thinking all fits in there. It sounds really cool. I think we've kind of jumped around a little bit. I want to go back to the acronyms, and I might be shifting gears a little bit here, but the acronym that's thrown around all the time is GMP and CGMP. And I know from working at STEMCELL that that can be oversimplified, and it sometimes doesn't mean what people think it means. I've learned that lesson. So I'm wondering if you can give us an overview on what GMP means.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's very layered. It means, just as the translation of the acronym is good manufacturing practices. Sometimes you'll see the C in front, and that means current. Because if you can imagine, these regulations were put in place back in, I'm going to have to look through my brain here, but I'm going to say in the, I think in the 70s, 60s, 70s. So it's a long time ago, and I'm pretty sure they didn't think through all the different types of technologies that we have in place today. So that's why that C is there, and that is why the FDA and other regulatory authorities around the world put out guidances. And so that is important to keep track of that. So that is what the acronym means. When a common misunderstanding of it is that it's only the manufacturing, okay? It is not. It is from concept or idea all the way to getting it into the patient's hands. Or patient's hands, pardon me, the carer's hands to administer to the patient. So it is, you need to build what they call quality by design into that development and design of the product. You can't just expect magically that it's going to be safe and efficacious. So it's that scientific rigor with a blend of compliance that you build in up front. And then you manufacture, yes, that's the piece too, but then you test it, you store it, you ship it. So all of those things are inclusive to GMP. So that's often sometimes where people get stuck, is it's only the stuff that happens in the clean room, but that is not the case. It's the wide ideation to full commercialization and getting that product into the end user's hands. Another area of or another way, the way that I like to explain GMP is if I asked even just the three of us, okay, never mind, 1,000, okay, just the three of us to go make a batch of lasagna, the chances of it being exactly the same is going to be 0. But with good manufacturing practices, and now I am just thinking about mostly the manufacturing, but if we put in place the exact same equipment that all of us had to use, this exact same raw materials that were supplied by the same suppliers, all the same menu, or pardon me, recipe, all the same, I think I mentioned equipment training. Now, what are the chances? Well, it's going to increase dramatically. And that really is the goal of GMP, is to have a robust product that is exactly the same every time. So those are the types of controls that you think about with GMP. But as I said, it even starts earlier than that, all the way to getting it into the end user's hands.
So maybe you can help clarify for people what GMP means. So if something is GMP certified, what can happen?
So products cannot be certified to GMP. There is a caveat with certification of facilities, which is something that is done in Europe, but not in North America. So this can cause confusion for end users. So it is critical that you follow GMP for the manufacture of your cell and gene therapies, for example, but the FDA will not certify that product as GMP, for example, but it will increase your chances of having a successful NDA or commercialization of that cell and gene therapy.
I think a really good example of this is the COVID vaccines, actually. So when they came out under emergency use authorization. And Pfizer first got full approval, followed by Moderna. They were under EMA for so long because the clinical trials were successful, but they hadn't completed their paperwork showing adherence to GMP manufacturing and then having an inspection, which is required before something can go through. So that's that plant that in Europe, the entire plant can be certified, but in the US, it's site by site each time for each drug. And so then what happened was Pfizer's a much bigger fish than Moderna, right? So it was much quicker to be able to go through that whole GMP process to submit the rest of the licensing application, which is called Module 3 in the US. That's the CMC manufacturing part. And so it got done, and the Moderna had to wait and get all their stuff ready, because as a biotech with your first drug, it takes a lot longer to spin up than Pfizer's 50th drug. And so you have to then meet all those standards, and it goes through. So I don't know of any regulator that will allow a pharma product out, except in some very rare, exceptional cases of like one-person treatments that isn't GMP, but it's not certified. It's you're adhering to those standards. You show it, you prove it. And that's where the master file comes in, is you have that all on file. So then it's hidden from me, the pharma company, using you, stem cells, cell therapy, but I can trust as the pharma company buying it that you have a master file on site the FDA has seen, and I can then get your approval to cite it, and they can go look at all the details and make sure that, yes, you're doing it right for my step. And then I say, I took your cells and did the next 5 things to them. And that's what I'm putting in. But all the secrets that you have, they've also seen and can say, yes, this adheres to all the standards. So it's a set of standards, but you can't be certified as hearing that. It's license by drug license, which was fine until you got to the cell therapy and some other eras now where you're starting from common stock materials in kind of a different way with a lot more complexity than, say, your saline that was, manufactured sterilely. So now it's much harder, which I think, to your point, is why you're working on these ISOs and other regulations to try to put in place as guidances to try to push the world along, right?
Yeah, and around the reagents, yeah, just to clarify, we don't at this time offer any of the starting materials or cell materials, let's say, for downstream users to manufacture their cell and gene therapies. We only provide the reagents, or sometimes they're called ancillary materials or raw materials. So those are the focus of that stem cell.
It's like cell media, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Cell culture media, cell separation kits, etc. Yeah.
But you can imagine an era, right, where there's GMP stem cells available.
Oh, yes. And absolutely. And for example, there are companies that provide GMP leukopaks. So that's exactly where we would love to go as well.
I think you both touched on this a little bit, the rare diseases or the like personalized medicine and the exceptions. I don't know if the word exceptions is right, but maybe you can clarify like the different processes you can go through than necessarily the regular kind of large scale processes. I think it's called acceptable risk, but I don't want to step in a pile of, I don't know all the words.
I'll start, but then absolutely, I think Jason is living this life versus stem cell or me as an onlooker. But my understanding is that in each jurisdiction or each major jurisdiction, there has been an expedited process that is available for orphan indications. So there are several of the cell and gene therapy clinical trials that are leveraging this expedited process with good reason. So, but I'll let Jason chime in on perhaps more of the details.
So the drug I helped get approved was both orphan and breakthrough status. So breakthrough means a novel therapy for which there isn't anything else out there on the market, or it's a kind of game changing in a variety of ways. And I'm speaking in layman's terms here versus regulatory statute, but that gets you some accelerated timelines in your licensing approval. And then there's orphan, which gives you other benefits as well. And that's for something that's a rare population. So I think please don't quote me exactly, it's about 25,000 or 30, anywhere between 25 and 50,000 people a year, cases a year in the US at least, can get you orphan. And so this then changes the trial requirements they may look at for you, So you may not need 10,000 people in your trial. You may not need 2 pivotal trials. You may need 1. And so between both of those, you have different levers of acceleration. Breakthrough also lets you talk to the FDA and have pre-meetings with them, at least in the US, and other countries have similar systems where you can go, hey, I have this idea. I want to do it this way. Can I talk to you about it ahead of time? And usually FDA is like, just submit it, get in line like everyone else. But for these breakthrough indications, they'll talk to you ahead of time. Essentially what they did with the COVID vaccine was super de-duper breakthrough. Or like they could just call them up and say, we want to put this in our package. Are you okay with that? Yeah, send me the data tonight. I'll look it over and go. And that's how they progress that so fast. But then there's also pathways of like, you're never going to get a drug approved. Like this is one person in the world, there's 10 people in the world with this disease. You're a company that can make a custom genetic modification for this one person. They have pathways to approve it as like a mini clinical trial with an N of 1, with the patient obviously consenting and all the risk and everything. And so that's kind of a separate like emergency compassionate use pathway for people who like, it's not going to be a product, right? This is like biotech companies or other groups or philanthropic endeavors to try to get one-off treatments here and there as well.
That makes as much sense as it can for me. I understood all of that. It's back to Lynn's point where like there are hard rules and then there are nuances to everything, and you have to be able to kind of navigate all of that at once. So this is another question that we've touched on a little bit in some of your answers, but it sounds like the global regulatory landscape is pretty fragmented, but there are parallels and sort of an effort to kind of bring it together. So maybe can you speak to where it's working and where it's not working as well as it could be? And then is there an ideal state? Like would global standards or guidances, I guess, make sense?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And absolutely, it would be desirable to have the global one pathway. Recognizably, that is very difficult at this time. We can't agree on much as a global society. However, there are efforts from different organizations, whether that be ISO, whether that be the WHO, and then even some of the organizations like ISSCR, ISCT that are looking and trying to really align and synergize. And there are some good steps forward with that. Something to consider that does make sense from a clinical trial perspective, and maybe Jason can comment on this, is that we need to ensure that we have clinical diversity. So when we run a clinical trial on predominantly white people in the US, we can't expect that that drug is going to perform equivalent in China. So there is even though it could be a global standardized process for that one aspect, there is absolute considerations around our genetic differences that we have to study and ensure. And then there's also the geopolitical situation that we're in that I think brings complications when we want to, work with some of these regions where they don't have the same sort of baseline requirements. It can get tricky for a business to navigate that that quagmire of information. So that is something that can be a bit challenging to bring that sort of global standardized process in place.
You could also imagine if you had to do one trial for the whole world, you'd never get done because of the funding cost.
Yes.
How you tend to see it go in waves across different markets because of the genetic differences. There's also different, it's more than just the genetics though. So depending on your product and your cell therapy, you have different treatment regimens. So if I want to create a cell therapy to be used as a third line treatment for leukemia, well, what are the first two lines of treatment? And that's going to be different in every country. And so then your product is really specific to that. Well, now maybe my third line treatment in the US is a second line treatment in Europe. So it's actually easier to make my product a second line after second line treatment in Europe as a follow on to my study here, or vice versa. And so you get into the complexities of the overall care system as well. And then, I work in a space that's donor derived. So things come from people. And if they're donor derived, then the donor also matters, right? And this is also true of cell therapies, is the viruses and pathogens and bacteria and everything that exists in the milieu that you're going to screen for and check and all of that are wildly different country to country. And so the only places that aren't very different from each other actually are the US and Canada. Interesting. But even us compared to Western Europe are wildly different. And so now, even if you have standards of like screen for endemic disease, that's almost a useless guidance because the list is going to be different everywhere. And now we're back to relatively vague criteria that everyone has that you have to go interpret site by site. So a little bit the inherent regionality of people, which is what you see to an extent with nations, is the fact that you have to do it separately because each group's population has different considerations. I think you see this as a difficulty in the EU because it's actually more heterogeneous than the US, and getting EMA guidelines all the way through and agreed upon between all member states for the Europe is politely messy, I think is a nice way to put it.
Yeah, I'll comment on that. It is messy for sure. The different questions that we get, even as a supplier of reagents, it can vary dramatically depending on the country. And it is difficult to gain access to have conversations with those regulatory agencies of each country because, again, we are just the reagent supplier. And Europe will not accept regulatory support files nor master files. So it really does get sticky. So it is definitely a complicated region.
Does that create a confidentiality barrier then, or an issue there when you're trying to submit for a company that wants to do it in Europe because you don't have a master file to leverage?
Hugely. And it's frustrating for both the sponsor because they're just trying to, get something out to commercialization, but you can't downplay the fact that STEMCELL as a supplier, we rely on our IP to ensure our longevity as a business. So it cannot be dismissed.
Can you submit as like a private confidential communication alongside the sponsor so that the sponsor can't see it? Or is that just, or who knows, you're working on that?
Yeah, no, we've been successful with that in the UK as well as in Korea. But now the UK is not part of Europe. And we have recently experienced that the reviewer of this particular dossier refuses to accept a regulatory support file. And I have no way of talking to them to ask how we could create a win-win situation. So this is a current dilemma that we are working through in the last 3 weeks, that we are doing our best with. We definitely want our customer to succeed, and we will do everything in our power to do so. And we will also create some way to have a conversation with the EMA. It is not as readily obvious as the FDA makes it on how to create these conversations with the regulators and people such as STEMCELL. But in the EMA, I'm determined to figure it out.
Messy,
yes.
Yeah, it comes right back around to the questions we were asking in the beginning about career advice and guidance and what you would tell somebody who wants this job. And that was supposed to come at the end of the interview, but I think we've come full circle here, because you really need to know the science. You need to know the landscape itself and the messiness globally, but you also, it sounds to me like you have to have a bit of a lawyer's mindset where you're trying to figure out, or how to have these conversations and how to, like you said, get to a win-win situation. Yeah. Any final comments on to our listeners, knowing that, Lab Coats and Life is about how to help scientists thrive, like what, from a career perspective, or if they are actually, trying to navigate something through the regulatory landscape, any guidance or any final thoughts?
Yeah, I want to pick up on your point around, although you didn't say it, but it's influencing. So I think that's a key part of the regulatory affairs professional's job, is that you need to influence the regulators. And as Jason pointed out earlier, it's about creating a narrative that effectively justifies the technical strategies that you chose for your particular product, whether it be an ancillary material or a cell and gene therapy. And the other one is influencing internally to the business to gain buy-in as to what those compliance requirements are. So that's a key skill set, I would say, for those interested in possibly pursuing the regulatory affairs space. I think it's really exciting, but you hopefully have gotten a sense today that it is a very exciting possibility as a career path. It combines the science, but also the business, as well as, like we mentioned, orientation to detail, detail oriented, there we go, as well as connecting the dots, and sometimes that can be really, really complex, because you got to connect the dots from a macro scale, from a global scale, but even all the way down to the micro scale within your business. So if you are interested, please reach out. I would be very excited to talk about a career in regulatory affairs with anyone interested.
Anything we missed, Lynn? Anything that you are often asked, and like misconceptions or questions that you wish people could just know the answer to, or know that there is no answer to, or something like that? Yeah,
one piece of advice that I've given, and I actually stood up at a conference one time in one of the rooms, and I made this suggestion. It wasn't received that well, but just from the energy that I felt. But it's that, we all have roles in a business. And so when you are, you could be trained as a scientist, or as Jason, as a medical doctor, and which is amazing. And there's some people that can do it all, but I would say the most of us can't do it all. And so it's really about, just because you're a scientist and you are probably excellent at that specific area doesn't mean you need to be the absolute expert in regulatory affairs. There are people that are dedicated to that. So leverage them, like learn, be open, collaborate. That is something that I think is, and more in the startups, obviously not in big pharma, there's roles for everybody, but I would say that sometimes when we're talking with, those customers that have that twinkle in their eye that they've got this amazing technology and they hope to get this into patients, is that they try to do it all themselves, and they really, really will benefit from having either a regulatory consultant or hiring an appropriate regulatory role within their business. It will save them time and money in the long run.
That's excellent advice. Thank you. Jason, any final thoughts to add?
I would just double down on it. The most work I've ever done professionally was writing regulatory documents for a filing in a biotech. And if you haven't done it before, you need people to help you who have done it before. It is not something you can just go read a book and do.
Doesn't sound like it. Lynn has a 28-year career building up to it, and I think you're right that you're still learning and growing, and it sounds like that it's just never something you can fully master. Okay, well, thank you very much, Lynn and Jason. That brings us to the end of our show. Everyone, don't forget to sign up for our email list at www.labcoatsandlifepodcast.com to get show notes, episode summaries, and links to useful information, or learn more about STEM mentorship via the resources found at www.stemcell.com/labcoatsandlife. You can also reach out to us on Twitter via STEMCELL at STEMCELLTech, or by email at info@labcoatsandlifepodcast.com with feedback or to suggest guests.